What do you think the benefits of the procurement and sustainability shared service will be from your perspective and from Bedford schools?
Well, I think it gives us expertise probably as a starting point that we don't have, because we're relatively, small to medium-sized MATs don't have lots of in-house expertise in procurement, and I think that's where working with Value Match, you bring that to us and you bring your experience of working in other parts of the country, other schools, and that we can tap into that and ideally then build something that benefits our schools and benefits other schools in our region, in the sector.
Yeah, I think it's a great opportunity to focus on improved outcomes. I think looking to work with suppliers in a collaborative way, but to create a better understanding of schools and the requirements, because they're quite unique really in terms of the demands that you all face. What sorts of challenges do you have at the moment in terms of procurement specifically?
Capacity, I think. We run our schools as efficiently as possible, and we want to make sure as much money as possible goes into educating the children, because that's where the money needs to be, in teaching and getting people in front of into the classroom, which puts a lot of pressure on the central team, puts a lot of pressure on running a central support service for different types of schools in different locations, and therefore you end up squeezing on that central service and making it run as efficient as possible. So therefore trying to find the value in procurement and bring that expertise into procurement becomes quite difficult, becomes quite challenging. And particularly now we're looking more than just pounds and pence. Actually what we want is sustainable procurement. That becomes even more difficult.
It's great. It's interesting because the work we've done undertaking some spend and contract analysis, there's a lot of transactional activity in schools, disproportionate really for, I think, what schools need, where we've seen examples in areas such as workplace solutions where you can have 60, 70 suppliers, thousands of transactions, which that means the central team's processing all of that activity, and I think possibly lose sight of the potential benefits and value they could obtain.
Well, we can't. We end up not having any relationships with suppliers, any opportunity to challenge those suppliers, to have constructive conversations about where we might find value with those suppliers, because there's just too many of them and there's too many transactions to actually process. And I think even the conversations we've had since we started working has given a different slant, a different view on how we manage that and how we think about our suppliers going forward.
I think there's a significant benefit in efficiency where I think just in one area of expenditure where we reduced 3,500 transactions and invoicing down to 12 invoices, which must be a massive benefit for the finance team.
I mean, we are always trying to find efficiencies in finance, and I think we've been very much led by, I suppose, what our staff want. They want things immediately and they want things now, and therefore you end up ordering 10 pencils here, 20 pencils there, with all the deliveries that links to, and all the goods received notes and all the invoices, and trying to make sure you run a really high quality finance team that passes muster with auditors. So thinking about it very differently and suddenly going, oh wow, we can reduce 3,000 to 12. Why have we not done that before? So yeah, it's certainly going to bring an awful lot of value.
I think that case was really interesting because we also saved about 42% on the total expenditure, which I think was about just shy of £60,000, which is almost like the equivalent of 2 teachers, as well as the efficiency, which I think was a real eye opener, but did require some change of behaviour from the schools themselves and people placing orders. So instead of placing an order for £20 delivery next day, we put some more scheduled deliveries in place, and we had to work with the schools a little bit to explain why that's a benefit. But it does come back to your point of every penny should really go to education and for the children's needs. And that's really important.
It is. And I think it is change, and people, lots of people don't particularly like change. It can be quite difficult to go through. But when we talk about this type of change, we talk to our teachers in our schools and explain why we're doing it. I think once they understand the why we're doing it, and you put it in the context of actually this will give you another teacher, this will give you 2 more TAs in your classroom to deploy. All we've got to do is put a bit more structure in how we buy and when we buy and perhaps who we buy from. It's a no-brainer. Everyone's fine. Okay, we'll do that. That makes sense to us.
And you talked about sustainable procurement, and what was really interesting with that particular example is not only did we reduce the number of invoices, but we also reduced the number of deliveries, and those deliveries are done by electric vehicles. And I think we saved 24 tons of carbon on that particular contract. That's just one contract in, I think, across 12 schools. So the potential benefits for having more control and discipline enables us to really have a positive impact for the environment as well, and give greater control and discipline.
Well, I think that's where the conversation, particularly around the climate part of sustainable procurement, has got us really thinking about not just gas and electricity, and that's really, really important, not just about the footprint that we create ourselves, but we're having that wider conversation about what is the footprint that we create indirectly via our suppliers. Now, that's not a question I don't think any schools have particularly in the past asked themselves, nor really had to ask themselves. Whereas we do now, we need to be asking those questions because we are driving those emissions, and we need to take responsibility for those emissions. And through procurement, which is the route to those emissions, think about, okay, what's our responsibility for that, and what can we do differently to try and change and reduce that down for the whole sector. I think there's a lot of power that we have to be able to do that through just thinking about procurement in a different way.
And I think you made the point, I think, really important about having the capacity and capability, which it's really difficult from our experience in schools. At most, we've seen maybe one person allocated to procurement.
Yeah.
And then they may do some sustainability, but the schools can't really afford the expertise in even the largest multi-academy trusts don't have the level of spend that would really justify the types of teams we're able to deploy across on a shared service basis, where we can have an IT specialist, a construction specialist, and people focusing on sustainability.
Yeah.
That's just not going to be available to in-house teams.
No, and very early on in our sustainability journey as a trust, we thought, well, okay, gas and electricity, yes, we can measure them. We've got capacity in-house, we can do that. That's fine, and we can report on that. And we can ideally put systems in place that will reduce that. I think very early on we were scratching our head thinking procurement and sustainability is just going to be too hard probably, and we're going to have to wait for other people to solve this problem. Maybe we can do little bits around the edges. But it was very much identified early as that's going to be a problem to measure and a problem to actually do something about. And I think it was only really when we started talking to Value Match that we saw a potential answer, a potential solution that, for all it wouldn't solve sustainability in overnight, actually it will give us a roadmap through managing our suppliers and procurement to get to a point in a reasonable period of time where we can say, actually, we're doing more about sustainability and procurement, or actually having an impact. And that's ultimately what we want to do.
Yeah. And I think also within the model of the shared service, and we thought quite long about what's the right way of deploying that resource, because I think most organisations, just due to the complexity of skills and the geographic spread, so everyone's remote offerings or provide remote service. But we believe that you really need on-site teams, or at least some procurement expertise sitting within the organisation, within the central teams, to understand their specific challenges, because obviously, schools have very, very different sorts of socioeconomic sort of drivers. They've got different types of problems, whether it's older buildings or modern buildings or a combination of estate. So our model of deploying people on site, I think, adds a huge amount of benefit.
It does. It gives. I mean, a lot of running schools is about relationships. It's about people. You know, we are basically, school's a collection of people, as is the central support team. Having that person on site that we can build a relationship with means we can have better conversations. We can feel like we can have open and honest challenge, open and honest support. If we're doing something that we think, actually, could we do that differently? I think having the relationship means you can have that conversation without anyone's going, hang on a minute, well, you know, don't challenge us like that. Actually, I think that flips on its head when you've got that person here, and I think that's been really important.
Yeah, we've definitely seen it across all of the schools we support. I think one of the challenges, the biggest challenge, I think, both on the supply side, interestingly, and on the customer side, is behaviour change. So where you put a contract in place, and is everyone optimising and using that contract? And you've been good enough to allow us access to your finance system, so we can start to put a contract in place and then look at the utilisation and areas which in procurement speak we'd say is non-compliance, not using the contract. But then going and talking to, you know, the teachers or the support teams and saying, why haven't you used that contract? Is it a lack of communication, understanding? Doing that remotely is really difficult. Doing it in the moment and just going and having a conversation and then either adjusting the contracts, talking to the suppliers about the products or services they're providing, or just informing the teachers and administrative staff and support teams about the benefits of using the contract. It takes away a lot of the issues very, very quickly.
I mean, I think most of it is habit. A lot of it is just that's the way we've always done it, and we don't want to change that, because actually we've got so many other priorities and so many other things to think about. I don't want to think about that. I just want to do it. And changing that habit and changing that way of working does take a little bit of time, but it takes relationships, it takes engagement, it takes talking to people. But because the why we're doing it, people understand, people get, we talk to them about it all the time. Actually put it in that context, put it in that frame, they will come around. They say, fair enough. Yeah, okay. You just tell me what to do. And away we go. You might get some challenge back, you might get some more questions back, but it's a conversation.
And I think the conversation based on evidence is really important. So the transparency we want to bring, the sort of weekly, monthly reporting, so we can see the benefits. We can see areas that aren't working as effectively, or if a project is particularly challenging, maybe it's a lack of specification, maybe it's a difficult supplier. How we manage that over a period of time, I think, is really beneficial as well, because we can see where the issues are, but we can also calculate and measure the benefits that the schools are receiving. And it's a collaborative, combined view, as opposed to it's an arm's length view of what we believe our performance with it. It's one transparent view of delivery.
It's a big change, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of tearing up the rule book of how we used to do things around procurement, which was very much, you've got a pot of money, that's all you've got to spend. We don't have lots of spare money lying around, so you need to squeeze those contracts for as much money as possible, squeeze those resources as much money as possible, and ultimately that just leads to, well, you buy the cheapest, and that's not necessarily. We all know that doesn't necessarily give you the best value in terms of products, but also it's not the most sustainable. It doesn't impact sustainability. It's not a long-term solution. It's just very short-term to make sure the pounds and pennies add up, which we've talked about a little bit. Is around we value sustainability and we put it right up there. We don't think we should compromise on that. We don't think there is a compromise to be had on that. I think others will see, do you have to compromise part of your budget to actually afford sustainability, to be able to afford what we want to do?
That's a really good question. I from what we've seen, and again from an evidence base, the answer is no. We've been able to deliver sustainable outcomes, social impact. We quite a lot of the skills we're working with are in relatively sort of socioeconomically deprived areas. We've been, I think, because we're designing in sustainability and social impact in terms of the criteria we bring suppliers on. So we're measuring the base behaviours and what they're committed to. We're designing sustainability and social value as a core part of the products or services, as opposed to an add-on, which I think unfortunately is all too frequent at the moment. I think once you're thinking about it in those terms, I think we're able to deliver improved efficiency, savings, and have either less of a negative impact or a positive impact depending on the product or service that we're buying. Some of the things we've been able to do is we've taken the Cabinet Office model on social value, but we've overlaid it with very specific educational requirements, such as the Gatsby benchmarks. I mean, there's a huge thing around, I think, enabling pupils to be successful in school, but also successful in life and a career path through that process. So they get, apprenticeships, or maybe get help with CVs and so on and so forth. I think the key thing, though, is contracting for those outcomes. And we haven't really seen that many contracts that have really had that level of focus. And I think schools have really missed an opportunity.
Yeah.
But many parts of the public sector are missing that opportunity as well of really getting additionality for their expenditure, and building that into the way they're approaching procurement and managing suppliers.
And we missed that. We've procurement, we focused on what we got a contract, pounds and pence, thank you very much. How long is it going to last? Is it going to deliver what we need? And I think we, as a trust, certainly missed the social value part of it. And I think it was our discussions that actually caught us up with some of that social value, and joining the dots between all these things that we do for the children. Actually, you can link them in to the work you're doing around procurement. Our focus early on was around how do we build climate sustainability and outdoor space sustainability into what we're buying, and making sure our impact on the planet was a positive one. Definitely, that's where we want to go. But I think the conversations we had have certainly broadened that definition of sustainability to bring in that social value aspect and think about, okay, well, we've got careers, we've got a strong careers offer. Why are we not linking who we're buying from and what we're doing into that careers offer? We have apprenticeships and we value apprenticeships, and some of the apprentices we've got are brilliant, but we're not, again, linking that back to finance and procurement. And why not?
The starting position, I think, for most sort of multi-academy trusts, because they're still relatively new in formation. So where you've got 10, 20, 30 independent organisations coming together, that's a big change in its own right. And then there's a strategy overlay which says, how do you want to leverage procurement for improved outcomes, efficiency, value, and sustainability and social impact? And I think you can't really do that if you've got 2,500 suppliers in your ledgers, and you don't have a strategic relationship with any of them, and you haven't got contracts that's going to enable you to hold the suppliers to account to support you in your both efficiency, value, and outcomes you're trying to achieve. So I think one of the opportunities we have as a shared service is to work with less suppliers more strategically and create the relationship that enables them to support that type of activity within the schools. And I think it does come with some scale as well. If we can put, a £5-10 million set of contracts as a shared service in place, we're going to get a lot better social impact than if we're doing £100,000 type contracts and just going to have a much bigger impact, which I think is additionality to all schools.
And I think and I suppose this is where we're on this journey, is changing the nature of the relationship we therefore have with those suppliers. So rather than having no relationship with several thousand suppliers, which, being very honest, is kind of where we start, our starting point, is narrowing that down to a few suppliers, but not seeing it as so much of a we buy from you, we give you some money, you give us the goods or services. Actually having a bit more depth to that relationship, and ideally, and like you say, it's very difficult to do this as an individual school or a small trust. Impact what that supplier does and how they see their role in our sector, in the big wide world as well.
And I think this then addresses a number of different areas, including sort of supply chain management, transparency. Is there modern slavery in the supply chain? Where's the products coming from? I mean, I asked this question to Matt not so long ago. They said, where's the products coming from that you're giving to the children? And if that's coming from 100 different suppliers and they've got thousands of suppliers in their supply chain, how do you know that there's no modern slavery in there, or whether you're really promoting the right type of sort of ethics in that supply base? And it's impossible to know. And we were able to work with a number of suppliers now, in much more detail and in depth, tracking carbon in terms of deliveries and emissions, assessing their supply chain capabilities. And I would say that most suppliers are still reasonably immature in terms of managing that. But at least then we're having a discussion that says, we want this level of transparency, we want some assurances over where the products are coming from. And over time, this is going to become more and more challenging. We want more evidence-based, we want greater transparency. Because I think that's generally where the world's going. And we know there's areas and countries at risk. We need to manage that effectively. And we also want them to use local suppliers.
And I think that's really interesting, because we naturally want it, because we naturally want to support where our schools are located, support the local economy, create the jobs that ultimately quite a lot of our students will end up in local employment. And it's something we've always had an aspiration for, but we've never had a tool to actually enable any of that. I would have certainly never thought about how do we contract for that? How do we build that discussion with any supplier at all, other than just trying to buy locally, which is not something you can. It's very ad hoc. It doesn't really work in any sort of strategic sense. How do we do that, and then how do we measure that, and how can we then report back to our schools, our communities, and say, this is what we're doing. This is what this trust stands for. So we're having a positive impact on the environment, we're having a positive impact on the world, but also we're having a positive impact on the communities where these children live and will grow up.
I think there's an example that someone told me where they were contracting for food, and it was local. It was through an intermediary through one of the wholesalers, but basically it was a local abattoir providing the meat through the wholesaler. But actually, they traced it back to the farm and the field, and actually the children in the school were from they knew people who were working in the abattoir. And one of them, it was their farm, and then you've got that sort of also insight in terms of what does good really look like. It's a local supplier. We can see the positive benefit in the community. That money is being spent within the community, but then reduction of food miles and the food provenance, and that's where we've got to get to in most of our spend, because I think that really helps from an educational point of view as well. And there's a whole softer side to that.
Oh, I think it's really important. I think we talk about making education relevant to the children in that school. We can talk in a lot of theory in education. Obviously, we have to teach the children, lots of very important information. But if you can make that relevant to them, make it relevant to their communities, make it relevant to the child that's brought up in the middle of the countryside versus the child that's brought up in a very urban centre. Actually, the more we can maximise the benefits of what we're doing, and sounds odd. The more we can maximise the benefits of what we're doing through procurement in the finance department and make it relevant and engaging with the child in the school, in the teacher, in the classroom, well, actually, that whole, it starts to add up. I think the whole starts to add up.
Well, if we're talking about sustainability and positive impact, we're all consumers, aren't we? We all eat food, we all buy products, and, you know, that awareness of where do those products come from. But that sort of behavioural shift for all consumers starts with education, and we're better to do that than in school.
And I want that conversation with the schools about where their uniform comes from, and why we're buying their uniform in a certain way. Because, you know, if you're buying cotton, there is cotton that is coming from parts of the world that we really don't want to be buying from, and there is good cotton that is available and sold sustainably, and that's the cotton we want to buy, and we want to understand why we're buying that, and we want the children to understand that, and the children to understand, you know, how much energy, how much water goes into making their uniform, where's that coming from, what's the impact of that on the planet, and I think that then brings that whole curriculum to life. That brings that sustainability, climate change bit of the curriculum, and I know that, you know, the secondary schools are taught about fast fashion and clothing. Actually, if we're doing that and we're enabling positive change, and that then brings that, it makes it real, and I think that's really important.
One of which, we're on sustainability, so maybe just keep with the sort of Department for Education sustainability sort of action areas. How do you think that's been really taken on board in schools at the moment?
It's hugely mixed. I'd say most people, if I asked 100 people in a room who's read it, I might get one person that's put their hand up and, right, yes, we've had a look at that, and that's on our agenda. I think you've got some schools and trusts who are who will have that champion, who will naturally have that person who leaned towards that anyway, and has brought it into their schools and trusts and really gone with it. And there's some great, I suppose, champions out there in schools and trusts doing some brilliant work. I'd say the vast majority need support. They don't. They will all want to do it in some way or another, but either won't know where to start, won't know who to turn to for support. So there's an awful long way to go to actually really deliver a sustainable sector. So I think it's good, the fact we've got a strategy, the DFE have put a strategy out there.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge amount more work, though, that needs investing in.
And I think that was the rationale behind bringing together procurement and sustainability. First of all, most of the risk, both in terms of actual climate impact, but also areas like modern slavery, is in third-party risk. There's estate management and energy utilisation, but I would say the vast majority of the risk is in the supply base and the opportunity to have a positive impact. So I think that's why we wanted to bring together procurement and sustainability, and that was your sort of passion as well, to make sure we're driving that change. But I do think it's a bit of a concern overall that there is not enough recognition of the legal and policy obligations that schools and all parts of the public and private sector actually have, and that legislation and those policies are getting tighter, and that seems to me, to come back to another point around governance, that seems to me a bit of a gap at the moment that we see across schools.
And I think that's true, and I suppose in part, given the decade we've just had, and the significant changes that we've all experienced over the last few years, going through the pandemic, the change in the structure of the education system, how schools work together, the sort of legal entities that sit behind them, that has all changed. And I think, and dare I say the word Brexit, and change in external regulations that have sort of come off the back of that, schools have found all that incredibly difficult to try and navigate. And without limitless amounts of money to be able to invest in central services who can deliver all that, are you fully compliant with absolutely everything? It just becomes a really, you've got to focus on your core areas, and other things end up sort of getting pushed to one side, and hope we're doing our best is probably where it's got to.
And I think we see, and related to the governance area, I think there's a challenge around compliance with procurement regulations, and that sort of links to fiduciary responsibilities and internal financial obligations. I mean, there's quite a big mismatch between sort of contract registers and contracts in place, and who's spending money where and on what basis. There seems to be quite a lot of challenges and issues across schools.
Yeah.
And it's not, I think, through any lack of wanting to do the right thing. It's that prioritization and expertise, I think.
We work down our risk register and look at all the different risks we've got to manage. And some naturally filter to the top quicker, and you have to look at those and hope you've got enough time and hope you're doing enough. But I think that was another part of the reason of working with Value Match, because actually we recognised as a trust that's growing, we want to make sure that we're building those strong foundations now, and a lot of that is about compliance. If we're not compliant with everything we should be doing now, well, let's sort that out before we grow, rather than try and stick to the big problem later and have to unpick an awful lot of things. It's far easier to do it as a small to medium trust than it is to do it as a much larger trust.
And not get the benefits either. So like, if we can take 10-20% of the funds being spent on third parties and recirculate them back into the schools, we should do that through the whole process of improving competence, capability and positive impact as well, because that's the schools, financially there's a lot of stress in the system, I think.
Well, and ultimately we're not going to create the sustainable society we want without children having a quality education. And you don't get a quality education unless you've got quality teachers and quality staff in good quality schools. And therefore all the money that we can possibly save to put back into that will help us create that sustainable future.
I see quite a lot of challenging supplier behaviours. Certainly behaviours that we probably wouldn't accept in other parts of the public sector.
I'd agree. I think we've experienced it ourselves, where we've had contracts put in front of us, which has made it very, very difficult to either move away from them or look at all other options and assess things. Particularly because when you've got contracts that link into other things you do, or you've got one system ties into another system, ties into another system. And like I said before, schools are complex, they're complicated.
Yeah.
And without having supportive suppliers who understand that and are willing to work with you rather than protect themselves, that becomes problematic.
I think very difficult if you've got 30, 40 schools and you're trying to coordinate and maybe move them onto one core system, manage the estate in a consistent and positively impactful way, maybe with biodiversity. That's always going to mean there's winners and losers with the supply base, because you're probably going to rationalise some of those suppliers down. But some of the behaviours I've seen have been making it really difficult for schools to manage that process and both get financial benefit, but just operational efficiency and control.
They absolutely have. But we also recognise that we won't solve sustainability by ourselves. We need business, we need the private sector to work with us, to be partners in this. So it's a value partnership rather than a supply-demand partnership. I think that's probably the best phrase.
Yeah.
So we need to be able to filter out the poor behaviour and allow the suppliers who are willing to engage in the really positive behaviour. They're the people we want to contract, and they're the people, through a shared service we want to talk about with other people. So we want to be really positive for business, because ultimately business is going to be one of the cornerstones that creates this sustainable world that we want to live in.
There's lots of great suppliers, so it's really interesting. You've got really passionate suppliers who care about the sector because they're bought into education and future generations, and they're actually trying to do the right thing and work with schools, which is quite difficult if you looked at it at a national level. Just in England, 24,500 schools. it's not an easy sector to service compared to, councils or NHS even, and certainly compared to, say, central government, where you've got a handful of big departments. But so we've got fantastic suppliers, but we also have then suppliers who seem to be exploiting that and doing the wrong things. And I think certainly in our experience, we're identifying both types. And our strategy is let's work with 30, 40, 50 really great suppliers holistically, who really understand and get educated and actually are prepared to invest in education and work constructively and positively, both from an efficiency of value, outcomes, and a sustainability and social value.
If I could ask, a straw poll of schools, I think they would all put their hand up if they've experienced a supplier who's provided, shoddy goods or services and made them feeling this feels like I'm being shortchanged. This doesn't feel right. This isn't how, when we started conversations, this was going to end up going. They will all have those experiences. I would also say, and probably more so recently, that they will all be able to hold their hand up and say, actually, I've got 2 or 3 suppliers who, quite honestly, I wouldn't mind putting their names on the wall, and I feel quite positive and proud to work with those suppliers. Not loads of them, but there will be those 2 or 3 suppliers out there. Now, they're the suppliers that we should all be shouting about and wanting to get hold of and going, why? How can we engage with them? How can we have those conversations?
Absolutely.
And how can we get the ones that we've had shoddy service, shoddy support, don't feel like we're getting value for money, but we're tied into some long-term contract that we can't get out of, or we don't feel like there's a better alternative. How do we get rid of those and really promote the ones that, like I say, I wouldn't mind putting a plaque on the wall? I think they're doing a great job.
And it's really interesting. Over the last few years, we've seen both types, and we're now in a position where we can really we can benchmark, and we come across a particular organisation. We can say, actually, you can trust that organisation. We might need to look at some of the commercials and maybe some of the contracts, but actually, we know they're committed to deliver, and we've actually got a lot of interesting price points now, so we can quite quickly have a positive impact. We know they're committed to social value and sustainability. We can track that, and equally, we've seen some of the suppliers, we absolutely know that they are frankly exploiting the sector, making double-digit margins, and actually should be just avoided. So, we're hopefully able to address some of the poorer behaviour. We've got a bit more scale and maybe expertise, but more importantly, encourage the right type of behaviour and sort of navigate customers towards a better supply base.
Yeah, and that's where you get the scale. That's where scale comes in again, isn't it? Because you can have that greater influence, and you can start talking with a louder voice. About celebrate these people. Let's not celebrate so much, and let's try and push that sort of behaviour. And if they don't change, well, we stop working with them. If they're willing to change, if they're willing to see it in a different way, brilliant, that's great.
It's a new partnership with Heart as well, which is fantastic. But where do you see this going?
I think for Heart, I see it as in, over sort of 3, 4, 5 years' time, we will have a supplier base who we better understand, who we have a relationship with. So it's actually a positive relationship with, where we can talk about wider sustainability issues and what are they doing. I don't see it as all those suppliers. We will only work with suppliers who have got everything sussed and everything worked out. I see it as suppliers who are willing to work with us, so collaboratively we can get to that place where we're both having a really positive impact on society. That will take time, but I want to work with suppliers who are on that as well, and that's their ambition too. So 4 or 5 years' time, we've got a group of suppliers who we've both got shared ambitions around sustainability and social value, and we're all openly, transparently talking to each other and saying, this is what we're doing, these are the barriers, this is the next steps. So we're having that engagement. I'd say on the wider bit, what I want to do is take our learnings and grow that shared service, so we are able to influence and engage and support other schools, other trusts who are even earlier in their journey or have maybe taken a different route, to be able to say, no, actually there is a way through this, but we need to work collaboratively, we need to work together. So come and talk to us, come and get involved, and actually they'll bring things to the discussion that we won't have, and they'll bring suppliers and they'll bring relationships that we won't necessarily have. So we're having a much bigger footprint impact.
It's like
on that sector.
It's a multiplying impact, isn't it? It's having suppliers and schools working collaboratively with some support and management and expertise around that to actually drive that totality of positive impact on every level, and do that transparently, but do it as a sector.
Yes.
The schools, just the multiplier impact of that is really exciting.
Absolutely. Work together.
Yeah.
And we won't get everything right every time straight away, but working together, we will, we're all moving in the right direction with the right vision and values. We will get there, and it'll be, a much better place, much more positive place.
It's having the intent. So if you have that collaborative intent, and certainly at the moment, we're trying to set that tone. I guess we're trying to bring the best of public and private sector together in maybe better at relationship building sometimes in the private sector, in terms of really investing in that over the midterm, but with the rigor, transparency, making sure we're following the regulations of the public sector. But actually, we have to have positive conversations, and we need to share information and data, and it can't be arm's length. Certainly if you want to do things like nature corridors through school estates and stuff, that needs to be done holistically, and you need everyone to be part of that process.
It's a rewiring. It's a rewiring of how we do things. And I think if that trickle-down effect then means that in 5 years' time, we've brought the procurement and finance much closer to the teaching and learning in the classroom, whereas at the moment they're that far away. If they're much, much closer. If we've got apprentices working in our schools, or we've got apprentices working in other schools that have just, because they joined in this, I don't really care where they are. Actually, we're having a really positive on society, so it doesn't really matter to me. They can be anywhere. But through this, we've had a positive impact. Then that's the rewiring I think we need to see, and that's where I want to get to.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah.